thanks for joining us today. We'll be presenting an overview of Emerald Publishing's partnership with Oxford Analytica. Today we have two very dynamic speakers with us. We have Michelle Phillips, who is a Senior Product Manager with Emerald Publishing. She's based out of our UK corporate headquarters. We also have Dr. Megha Kumar, who is Deputy Director of Analysis at Oxford Analytica, which is a geopolitical risk consultancy headquartered in Oxford. She also heads their global risks practice, which focuses on critical cross-regional trends in technology, emerging markets, and sustainable development. Megha holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. We encourage your participation throughout the session, so please do pop any questions that you have into the chat throughout. After our speakers, we will certainly attempt to get through as many questions as possible, and the Q&A session will be handled by Lindsay Lambert in our marketing department. So again, thank you for joining us, and as always, fingers crossed there's no tech glitches with virtual webinars. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you very much, Erica. So we were very excited to announce at the beginning of this year that we'd entered into a new publishing partnership with Oxford Analytica. This collaboration has allowed for the creation of a unique digital resource as we move into a new decade with new challenges. Expert Briefings is designed for universities, and it's delivered through the new Emerald Insight platform. It offers universities access to the same daily information that leaders are already using to make real-world decisions. Expert Briefings can be purchased as a 5-year archive, and it's also available as a daily subscription with access to all the Expert Briefing contents, including the daily updates. Government and corporations around the world navigate changes using analysis from Oxford Analytica. So what are Expert Briefings? Expert Briefings offer unbiased analysis on political, social, and economic events. It's delivered in the form of daily briefs that provide instant updates. They explore the implications and impact of emerging trends and developments. These briefings are created from analysis by a team of over 1,500 contributors, and every briefing is objectively reviewed by Oxford Analytica's team of experts. That's why they can be trusted to be informed, accurate, and rigorous. It's also why they're used by world leaders working in government and industry to establish risk and inform strategy. In addition to the daily briefs, there's also an archive of over 20,000 expert briefings. So why did we think it was important to bring this information to academia? This is a resource that allows researchers to identify the most urgent problems of today, and it encourages research that can be directly applied in the real world, especially in the areas of business, politics, economics, international relations, and policy. The data is collated from many verified and sound sources, so there's no need to trawl through news and other websites that might have a political or a regional bias. They also have benefits for students. Expert Briefings has real-time content that your students can relate to. It can help them see how global and local events are shaping their future. They can also help you engage and inspire students with timely insights into topical events that are unfolding around them. And you can also rely on this trusted, evidence-based source to help your students apply their learning in the real world of work. Expert Briefings offers the thought leaders and influencers of tomorrow an historic framework of reference for the key decisions that they will make by exploring the context of past decisions that have impacted political, social, and economic events. The concise and structured nature of the briefing allows students to quickly identify the information they need to support or counter their arguments. It also brings benefits to faculty. We're in a climate of rapid change, and the teaching on core theories can remain relevant by applying analysis of recent events quickly and easily. You can tailor course content to your current students using both global and local examples. Oxford Analytica's experts have already done the work of distilling the data from multiple sources to identify what's important and also to understand the broader significance. Daily briefings provide a single source of current content that can be easily used as a pre-read for seminar discussions and debates, or to form the basis of lectures. So in order to show you how easy this resource is to use in teaching, we've taken the core subject of sustainable development and considered the various multidisciplinary themes, for example, gender and climate change. We can now consider them through the eyes of current events, creating quick but reliable content for courses in politics, economics, international relations, and management disciplines. And you can do this for a huge number of topics. This is merely a snapshot of some of the coverage of recent expert briefings. As you can see from the topics, such as COVID-19 and cybersecurity, the content is extremely relevant to what's happening in the world right now. And although it's published daily, it's unbiased analysis and interpretation of events as they happen. Internet searches can provide real-time updates on these types of topics, but the quality of the results can vary and they can't always be trusted. And unlike a newspaper, this is analysis by regional experts and not just a report of events as they happen. Key issues are analysed by the Oxford Analytica community of local experts who provide analysis, implications and predictions that capture the reality of events. This is a sample of some of the recently published analysis on events happening in your region. Oxford Analytica have a carefully structured process to identify the topic and use their unparalleled global expert network to write the briefing. Once the briefs are submitted, they're reviewed, edited and published. And this editorial process produces three main types of content. One of the unique features of expert briefings is that detailed analysis is condensed down into formats that can be read quickly and easily. The executive summaries are a very good example of this. They eliminate many hours of time needed for research as the content can be trusted. And as you can see from this example, it's very quick and easy to read. The language is clear and the format is condensed, providing insight into a topic for students at every level. And moving on to the long form, expert briefings are often published in this longer format. It's crafted to ensure that information can be consumed easily in a structure that includes an assessment of significance, analysis, and a conclusion. So basically, what happened, why it matters, and what's likely to happen next. And as you can see from this slide, the graphic analysis is another valuable feature. There's a huge amount of information on how COVID-19 can disrupt trends globally, but it's presented in a format that's engaging and very easy to understand. Additional information and sources are also provided in the links. In order to dive more deeply into the nature of the content that you would find in expert briefings, I'm now delighted to hand over to Dr. Magna Kilba, the Deputy Director of Analysis for Oxford Analytica.
Thank you. So, Michelle has already provided you all with a broad overview of what we do. Just to drill down on that briefly, so Oxford Analytica Daily Brief covers issues from multiple angles. A geographical angle, so we look at developments in specific localities, states, countries, regions. We look at issues from a cross-sector angle, so we may pick a sector such as aid or impact investment or aviation or banking and see what changes are happening in those sectors. We also look at global events from a thematic point of view, looking at trends and dominant ideas and how the world is actually developing along those trends, or some trends are changing and why, etc. One of those trends that we look at implicitly is liberalization, and I thought I would share some of our analysis on that issue with you today. So following the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, it seemed that the only show in town was liberalization. The fascism had been defeated at the end of the Second World War, and socialism had proved to be an unviable philosophy with which to order a country's economy and society. At the time, the onward march of liberal ideas, political and economic liberal ideas, seemed inevitable, it seemed linear, and it seemed global. Many observers at the time were very enthusiastic about this, and they described this turning point in various glorious terms. You know, Fukuyama described it as the end of history. Friedman said we are entering a flat world. Others called it a great convergence of the 21st century. The central idea was that the role of the state would not be so much to promote free markets in an unfettered way, which is a classic liberal idea, but more that the role of the state would be primarily to regulate markets and regulate competition as robustly as possible, as effectively as possible, so that the interests of the public would be more and more aligned with the interests of the business world. It seems to me that if we look at the world around us, the analysis we do shows us that these predictions are very, very shaky. In the post-pandemic world, these predictions are looking extremely shaky. The first question that I wanted to discuss was, is the world becoming more democratic? It's a theme that we cover extensively in the daily brief, from all sorts of angles, from the angle of from established democracies, wobbly democracies, paper democracies, and non-democracies. So if we look at the global level, I would have to say that the world is not moving towards a necessarily democratic direction overall. According to Freedom House rankings, between 1988 and 2015, there was a rise in the number of countries that could be classified as free, and there was a decline in the number of countries that could be categorized as not free. Since 2005, that trend seems to have reversed. The number of free countries is declining, the number of not free countries is increasing. And we are seeing this analysis completely gel with what we are finding at the regional and national level. So we have seen rollbacks in democratic freedoms in several important countries, India, in Turkey, in Hungary, in Uganda, for example. There was, the liberal promise was that as China, for example, embraces the neoliberal model, political liberalism would follow. Political liberalism would go hand in hand with neo-economic liberalism. But again, that does not seem to be the case at all. In fact, the trend is towards the opposite direction. Under Xi Jinping, repression, propaganda, and censorship have increased. China is breaking new ground in terms of technology-enhanced surveillance, particularly in Tibet and Xinjiang, but more broadly. The new security law in Hong Kong has cast a dark shadow over the political freedoms that city has long enjoyed. It's cast a doubt over the freedoms the civil society has enjoyed, its media enjoyed. Meanwhile, we're seeing the pandemic make a lot of problems worse. So in Hungary, for example, the government has introduced new emergency powers which have no sunset clause. So that undermines the role of parliament longer term. In Uganda, for example, we have a government that's used the pandemic to ban opposition rallies ahead of the 2021 general elections. And if we look at autocratic governments, initially from when the pandemic began, one of the issues we grappled with internally was what it would mean for autocratic governments. Would their control weaken? Would their control harden? Or would there be no change at all? Initially, some autocratic governments, for example, Vietnam, responded very well and public support for them increased. But over time, things have started looking a bit more shaky. So if we look at Belarus, Thailand, Zimbabwe, we have had higher protests in the public arena. People have been allowed to say things that they were not previously allowed to say. For example, in Thailand, you're not allowed legally to criticize the royal family and anything associated with the palace, but the military, the nominally democratic government in Thailand has allowed those grievances to be aired in public, which is absolutely unprecedented for Thailand. But the fundamental question is, are these governments therefore heading towards a slightly more liberal future? The answer so far is not. We don't see splits within these regimes, which seem to be central to shaping the future of these polities. So if the security forces of a regime or the broad political party that is in power allows, or at the very least condones, a change in government, only then can these autocracies fall or relax their grip. But so far, we see the trend we are seeing is that repression is going to increase because there is no split within the regime itself. So overall, the neoliberal promise that the global power would shift towards those that advocate democratic freedoms is certainly not playing out in the way that had been predicted 15 years ago. The next question then is neoliberalism delivering prosperity? That was the absolute central promise of these ideas at the turn of the century. In some important respects, that neoliberal model has delivered. So if we look at global poverty, for example, there has been a remarkable decline. Back in 1980, 40% of the global population lived in extreme poverty, which the World Bank defines as people living under $2 per day. That figure of 40% has fallen to 35% in 1995, it's fallen to 10% in 2015, and it has fallen further down to 8% in 2018. Equally, if we look at the provision of basic services to people around the world, there is absolutely no doubt that the provision of health, education, basic utilities, all these services has increased globally. If we look at digital technologies, the answer is obvious. The overwhelming majority of households in North America, in Europe, in post-Soviet world now have access to the internet. The number is close to 50% in the Arab world and across Asia as well, in developing Asia as well. So there's absolutely no doubt that gains have been made within the existing economic structure, but none of these gains can be taken for granted. And even the staunchest supporters of neoliberalism can argue that these gains have been even or have delivered gains equitably, because that is simply not the case. So we are seeing with regard to COVID that global poverty could increase, and the worst affected, of course, will be people in sub-Saharan Africa, followed by people in the poorest parts of South Asia. So the COVID pandemic's the worst economic impact of the pandemic is going to hit the world's poor disproportionately hard. We know already that women who have made very unequal, uneven gains in terms of gender equality are facing increased time poverty because of COVID. They're the ones who lost their jobs the most in the first wave of the pandemic. So for example, if we look at data from the US Bureau of Labor, we see that 60% of the people who lost jobs in the first wave of the pandemic were women, because they are disproportionately concentrated in tourism and services, the two sectors that have taken the hardest hit. Now, a lot of these jobs are never going to come back. We also know from data from the UN, for example, and several other women's organizations, that there has been a sharp rise in domestic violence across the world during lockdowns. And one of the most worrying statistics that came out of the UN a few months ago was that for every 3 months of lockdown, we could have 15 million more cases of domestic abuse than would have been the case if those lockdowns had not happened. So this is from the angle of just these two categories, people who are poor, people who are gender. But if we look at equality on a global scale, I think the statistics could not be more sobering. 8 people, literally 8 people on the planet own more wealth than the other half of the global population, i.e. more than 3.6 billion people. So, if the neoliberal promise was that if the markets in the state do their work well, they do their job well, then the balance of power would move towards public interest and away from narrow cliques and monopolies, then that promise has not been delivered at all. If anything, the cliques are becoming narrower, the monopolies are becoming stronger. Relatedly, the third question that really matters to us as at OA, and we cover this extensively, is the global community becoming more or less divided? The neoliberal promise at the turn of the century was that globalization was an unstoppable train, and that countries would be able to collaborate and settle their differences in a civilized manner in multilateral fora such as the UN, and whatever actions the global community takes would be, broadly at least, governed by international law, whether it be trade law, whether it be humanitarian law, whether it be laws of conflict, operations at sea, so on and so forth. In important areas, sadly, this is not the case. If we look at climate change, the evidence of the damage the planet is suffering is quite irrefutable. However, we have had the US withdraw from the Paris Agreement. We have had major countries such as Turkey and Brazil and India prioritize their near-term economic interests over longer-term sustainability. So under Bolsonaro, for example, we have tracked very closely at OA the rise in deforestation. And today, Bolsonaro has blamed forest fires within the Amazon region on indigenous people, precisely the community that most depends on and most actively seeks to preserve the Amazon ecosystem. In India, for example, under Modi and even the previous government, the plan is to increase energy reliance on coal-fired plants away from renewables. There are renewable promises, but they simply cannot match the reliance of the country on coal. With regard to COVID, the picture is not much prettier. We have a lot of energy in the global arena is being spent on tackling vaccine nationalization, where, for example, Oxfam has recently reported that rich countries who have only 16% of the world's population have actually made deals to acquire over 50% of the doses of the leading vaccine candidates. So there's a complete mismatch between countries that need it most and can afford it least, and the countries that have financed vaccine development and therefore have laid the first claim, a disproportionate claim to the number of doses that we may have once the vaccine comes to the market. So I also wanted to briefly link this to the sector of technology, because the onward march of globalization is clearly not proceeding as predicted. You know, national interests and nationalist leaders have clearly complicated the picture. And these stresses are apparent in several sectors, but technology is one area where it is extremely manifest. It's an important sector. It is high growth sector. This is the one sector that has delivered some of the tools that we all have come to rely on. So to an extent, the neoliberal regulatory framework has kind of worked for the technology sector. You know, we are using technology right now to communicate. This was not possible, would not have been possible if the industry had not been allowed to innovate and bring products to the market. We also know that, you know, health and education and other services have moved online. We know that e-commerce has allowed us all to shop safely from the comfort of our homes during the lockdown, and we can, many of us, not all of us, many of us can afford to continue working and educating our children and communicating with our families because of technology and what tech companies have been able to do. However, the failures, the weaknesses are also very serious. If we look at 5G, for example, one would have anticipated, if the neoliberal promise was delivering perfectly, we would have expected globalization to make the transition to 5G very easy. Now, 5G is basically fifth generation telecommunications technology. Most of us are now on 3G or 4G, and investment is happening on 5G. If globalization was moving straight and clearly forward, we would expect global integration to happen and technology supply chains to become more intermingled and ideas to be shared more closely, and the global conversation on standards and technical specifications to work very smoothly. But nothing could be farther from the truth. The US has banned several Chinese suppliers from building the United States' 5G infrastructure. Many countries have done the same: UK, Australia, New Zealand, several in Europe. The main concern is that Chinese technology companies have an unclear, opaque relationship with Beijing and its security apparatus. So these corporate players, although notionally in the private sector and notionally not owned by the state, could, at the behest of Beijing, steal data on the citizens of other countries. They could conduct surveillance, which is illegal and invasive. They could, in the worst case scenario, compromise critical infrastructure, because 5G would be critical to the future of the Internet of Things and to driverless cars and to the deployment of Internet of Things in infrastructure, so your power grid and your water grid and in absolutely critical infrastructure. So the skeptics of Chinese technology across the Western world and parts of the emerging world argue that we cannot have a non-clean carrier building our 5G infrastructure. So US has imposed restrictions on what kind of US technology Huawei and other Chinese suppliers can access. So in sum, what has basically happened is decoupling of technological supply chains when it comes to a critical area of technology such as 5G. The neoliberal promise of regulations has also failed in some other critical areas of big tech. And if we look at US companies, Facebook, Amazon, all the big ones are American companies, then the failures are extreme. The social media companies have been rightly criticized for disinformation campaigns, and disinformation campaigns that have affected the integrity of the democratic process, not just in the US, but attempts have been made against France, against Germany, against India. Equally, there are constraints on what disinformation online is doing to global consensus on critical challenges like COVID and like climate change. So there was a recent report on the UK which suggested that because of online disinformation, about 25% of the respondents in this survey thought that COVID-19 was a conspiracy of Jews. We've had several countries exploit the online disinformation space, partly facilitated by social media, to meddle in elections. So that the countries that are, the list of countries that are now actively trying to manipulate people's elections is just growing. So where Russia basically trailed the blaze in 2016, many others have followed: China, Iran, Pakistan, North Korea, or Saudi Arabia, Turkey, UAE. And regulators are far behind the curve on this. And we also have more and more concerns being raised in the EU, but also in Europe, about the monopolistic practices of big tech. So Amazon has been criticized for allegedly abusing its platform against third-party vendors. Apple's App Store has been criticized for disadvantaging independent developers with its high fee. Google has been accused of misusing its dominance in the search engine space to undercut its rivals. So in terms of the democratic principles, in terms of the prosperity neoliberalism promised, and in terms of the global dialogue that neoliberalism believed was going to happen, the picture is extremely complicated. But our analysis argues that the picture is still very messy. There are a lot of challenges that are being presented to these neoliberal ideas from within the system. So investors, for example, are investing in ESG bonds so that the environmental, social, and governance incentives are aligned with commercial incentives. We have the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, which is trying to broker a more healthy dialogue between rich countries that can afford the vaccine and poorer countries that slightly more desperately need them because of their demographic profile and their weaker health systems. And several investigations, as I said earlier, are underway in the monopolistic or unhelpful, socially irresponsible practices of big tech. So overall, I would argue that just as it was premature to predict that the 20th century, the close of the 20th century also brought with it an end to nationalism, protectionism, and regressive social values. Right now, it is premature to say that the neoliberal ideas are also going to collapse under their own failures. The world is extremely complicated, and there are several competing ideas at the national and international level, and the pandemic is going to expose the polarization of these ideas. We are far from moving towards a unipolar world in terms of ideas. It's multipolar, yes, it's become rather cliche to say that these days, but it's multipolar in a much more complex way, in a non-neoliberal way, as well as a neoliberal way. So I will bring it to a close, and I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you have some very exciting questions.
Thank you so much. Michelle, thank you for that very comprehensive overview of Emerald's partnership with Oxford Analytica, and to you as well for a really provocative presentation on pandemic impacts on the global and social order. We have arrived at the Q&A section of today's session, and Lindsay has been monitoring the chat box for questions. Lindsay, what do we have?
Okay, yeah, so I've been monitoring the chat. So the first question that I'm actually going to ask from Mega to answer. So this actually came through prior to the session. So the question is, what country, if any, has done a better job of protecting its disadvantaged social groups? And what role has been played by major philanthropies in providing relief?
Okay, well, yeah, that's a very interesting question. There are sort of two related but distinct questions. So first is, which countries have done better? There are two parts to this. If we look at overall sustainable development goals, then it is clear that no country is on track to achieve their 2013 UN Sustainable Development Goals. It is just not going to happen. And this was the case already before the pandemic began. Now, every indication we see suggests that we're moving further away from being able to achieve that. That said, countries that had a head start before the pandemic are likely to remain ahead because they've instituted structural improvements that have been long coming. So if you look at the SDG index, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, France, and Austria were absolutely at the top 5 countries in terms of being able to, in terms of making progress towards SDGs. The worst performing were Madagascar, Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo, Chad, and the Central African Republic. There is no change in that. If we look at the pandemic itself, then certain countries have performed better than others. New Zealand and Germany, for example, have done really well for different reasons, but they've done very well. Two of the most important reasons why those countries have done well is, one, their leaders have invested in public health services in a sustainable way for a long time, and that those investments are quite literally now paying off. And second, the nature of these leaders themselves, Jacinda Ardern and Merkel, they have invested in consensus-oriented decision-making during COVID. They have tried to build diverse teams and task forces. They have also invested in clear, transparent, empathetic communication with the public. And we have done a lot of analysis to examine that these are precisely the qualities that leaders need when faced with unprecedented crisis of the kind that we are in right now. Now, the role of philanthropic organizations is slightly more complicated. So if we look at established, very well-funded philanthropic organizations such as the Gates Foundation or the Wellcome Trust, and they have done a sterling job. Gates Foundation, as you will all know, has taken a lead in setting strategies for how vaccine distribution could work once we have it, and how they could leverage their existing distribution and local partnership structures in low and medium income countries. Wellcome Trust, for example, is a science-oriented philanthropic organization, one of the largest in the world, very, very well resourced. And their people and their intellectual capital has been entirely devoted to COVID-19 since the pandemic began. Then there are new philanthropic organizations such as, or mechanisms such as the PM CARES initiative in India. They've raised over nearly $900 million since the pandemic began. But the problem is that we don't know how those funds are going to be spent. We don't know what the priorities are. We don't know what distribution structures there are for these. So there are all these new ones about which there is a lot of doubt in terms of their impact. Then there are the third, and those are the majority of philanthropic organizations all over the world, which are smaller, more narrowly focused, so those that are based in specific countries from Southeast Asia to North America. And their focus can be much narrower, and their efforts, although effective in the near term for that narrow focus, have scalability problems, which I can go into if your audience is interested. But so overall, the point is that the role of philanthropic organizations in terms of providing relief for COVID pandemic is quite uneven.
Thank you, Megha. So the next question I'm going to put to you again, Megha. So what we have is, do you expect prospects for global cooperation to change if there is a change in government in the United States in November?
Yes, in important respects, a change in government in the US could improve prospects for a more promising global dialogue in some areas. Now, let me be absolutely clear. If Joe Biden is the next president, the US posture in the international arena is not going to completely change. It's not going to be a 100% change. The change is going to be in specific areas. So we expect US to take a slightly more positive role on climate change goals. After all, it was an Obama era policy. We expect the Biden administration to take a slightly less confrontational approach vis-a-vis China on sensitive issues like trade and technology. And we also, for example, would expect a Biden administration to take a slightly more constructive approach on Iran, because the US has moved away from the Iran nuclear deal. We would expect Biden to enter a more positive dialogue with the Europeans, who are keen to resuscitate part of the Iranian nuclear deal. Where we expect the policy not to change dramatically is in, for example, areas to do with technology. A Biden administration would be in complete agreement with the Trump administration on the cybersecurity risk that China presents. There is very unlikely to be a change in the US policy on 5G, for example. There's very unlikely to be a change in US strong armed tactics on cybersecurity and how to tackle cybersecurity attacks that are linked to the Chinese state. So some areas of global concerns would see improvement if there is a change in the US government, but in other areas, this picture is not going to change dramatically. But that is what we would expect. This is not a ping pong that swings from one direction to another.
Thanks, Megha. So I'm going to keep going with you, if that's okay. I've got another question for you here. So the question is, are the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals completely out of reach now?
Now, see, because I'm a risk analyst, I never ascribe 100% possibility or impossibility to any scenario. That's a fatal mistake any risk analyst can make, because the world can change very, very dramatically, and the pandemic has showed us how dramatic change can be. That said, it is highly unlikely that we would achieve the 2030 goals. One, because we were, before the pandemic started, already by the end of 2019, we were very far away. As I said, I think just a couple of minutes ago, no country was on track to achieve all its development goals before the pandemic began. Even the best performing ones, the Nordic countries, were at least 80% of the way there, but not farther. So in terms of countries and how they prioritize the goals, how they fund them, how they create internal mechanisms for achieving them, we were not doing really well. The funding gap was enormous. You know, I don't have the statistics right in front of me, but if I remember correctly, we were facing a nearly $2 trillion financing gap to fund the sustainable goals in emerging markets. With COVID, things have become even worse because the global economy would be lucky if it had any growth at all in the next few years. That is substantive. We are expecting budget cuts. We are expecting global aid flows to decline as budgets come under pressure globally. We are also, as I said, fighting with each other at the national level over things like vaccines. You know, this is not an era where we are really constructively talking to each other. And the corporate sector and the UN, for example, had placed a lot of emphasis on private sector funding for SDGs. The private sector is also facing serious problems. They just don't know what kind of a business outlook they should be preparing for the next 2 or 3 years, right? And major sectors have been affected. Aviation has fallen off a cliff. Tourism has fallen off a cliff. A lot of in-person services have fallen off a cliff. So in the face of this business uncertainty, you cannot expect the public sector to really cough up serious cash. That means that the policy attention of governments, their ability to prioritize longer-term sustainable goals, the ability of governments and private sector to fund goals is seriously impeded. So that puts us seriously back. The optimist in me seeks out data that suggests that there is a greater change happening overall in the world, where people are beginning to look at some of the structural problems. You know, so if you look at the shopping habits, for example, there's a very small example, but it signifies change, and your US-based participants will be particularly interested. This came out of the Black Lives Matter protests. It came out of the Me Too movement that affected the globe. The youngest cohort, so basically who are millennials and Generation Z, i.e. people who were born after 1982, we see a tangible change in their values. They want companies they work for, companies they buy products and services from, to reflect the values they hold, whether they be regard to sustainability, whether it be regarding diversity in the workplace, or around gender pay gaps, or the fact that the higher up you go in any hierarchy, government or public sector, you see fewer and fewer Black faces, fewer and fewer brown faces, and fewer female faces. As those values are changing, the attention is, for business and policy reasons, shifting to longer term structural problems. Therefore, I think some movement will happen on the sustainability issues. We may not meet those targets by 2030, which are always ambitious, more aspirations than goals. But like I said, the optimist in me looks out for that data, which suggests that the boat may well be traveling in the right direction still.
Thank you, Megha. So I'm going to leave you for a second, if that's all right, and I'm going to jump to Michelle, give you a moment to rest. So one question that we've had is, please can we explain the difference between expert briefings and the expert daily briefings?
Okay, so a little bit of the answer is actually in the name of the two products, but Expert Briefings is an archive of 5 years worth of briefing content dating back from 2019. And the daily expert briefings are actually the completely up-to-date content. So with the daily expert briefings, you get access to all the previous briefings, but then you also get new content daily addressing all the different issues.
Yeah, and if I may, I think it's more than safe to say that the archival content, which would be, you know, available in perpetuity, really is foundational. publish foundational topics that are salient right now and could prove almost kind of a reflection on their pedagogy and the classroom application.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Michelle. And another question while we've got you, Michelle, can my university library have a trial to Expert Briefings?
Absolutely. University libraries can set up a trial, and if you'd like to reach out to Erica, whose details are actually on the slide in front of you, she'll be more than happy to talk you through the options of setting up. And then we have a lot of material to support university libraries to demonstrate how the product works for their user and also the benefits it can bring their user and the discoverability. So Erica would be very happy to tell you more about that.
Absolutely. I think too it's worth mentioning that we are more than happy to facilitate a workshop, an informational workshop about the Oxford Analytica partnership, if that would be impactful. So do reach out. I am at your disposal.
Great. We have had a couple of questions come through. Sorry, Meg, I'm back to you now. Will government regulate social media more tightly in coming years?
That is where the evidence is currently pointing. So, for example, social media regulation is taking two main trajectories. One is to tackle disinformation, misinformation on social media and how content is regulated. And the other aspect is monopolistic behavior by big tech companies, because they not only own the largest platforms, but also the data of the people that are using them. So with regard to the first, are governments going to more tightly regulate social media companies? Yes, the EU, for example, had a voluntary code of conduct, which it has said recently is absolutely not working. All the big social media companies that you can think of have signed up to that code since 2018. Evidence suggests that that is not working. Now, in the next 6 months, the European Commission is coming up with two new laws. Both of them will tackle the issue of social disinformation for two reasons. One, because disinformation is undercutting democratic elections, the integrity of the electoral process. And second, because disinformation is a serious risk to public health. Like I said, half the people, people believe all kinds of weird conspiracy theories about the pandemic, which is undercutting the public health response. The second area where regulation is slightly trickier is monopolistic behavior. So as I said before, Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, they're all facing antitrust regulations. Here things get a bit sticky because Europeans have many investigations in train, and a lot of fines have been imposed on parts of their behavior. A lot of times companies have actually coughed up the money as well. In the US, the situation is complicated, but it is turning. The US antitrust law basically prioritizes the consumer interest. The basic argument is that if the consumer is not being harmed, then the government can stand back and let the market do its job. Because most of the services are free. Google is free, Facebook is free, Twitter is free. The argument is very hard to make that the practices of these companies are harming the consumer because the services are free. Where the regulation is therefore taking its turn is how these companies are using their dominance. So Google in search engine, Amazon in e-commerce, Facebook in social media, how these companies are misusing their dominance in their specific tech space to create data monopolies, and what they're doing on privacy issues. So there, like I said, the Europeans are more likely to take a stronger position than the Americans, even under a new administration. Some emerging markets are also beginning to take a tighter view. So Indonesia is taking a tighter view, India is taking a tighter view, but not everybody. I think I've answered your question.
Thank you. Thanks, Mega. So we've had a question come through, really, and I guess, so I suppose what we're asking is, what are the kind of predictions, what are our expectations in terms of a second wave for COVID-19, and also thinking about the realities of a vaccine, what again are our expectations, predictions for that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of countries most countries relaxed their lockdowns more or less over the last 2 months because of economic realities, or because they felt that the public health system was on top of it, or because they felt that they had contained community level spread. But now we are at the start of the second wave in most countries, right? The worst affected countries regionally, so the US in North America, Brazil in Latin America, India in Asia, UK in Europe. All these countries are looking at a tough winter. I think that is fair to say. It's particularly going to be tough for countries that are entering the winter season, so in the northern hemisphere, because we know that structurally, just sort of in a secular sense, irrespective of COVID, winter is a tough time because there are all kinds of seasonal flus which overwhelm the health system, but also lower our immunity, especially if for older people who may have an underlying condition. We know that because of winter, central heating, and more indoor work, we are at greater risk of spreading the infection. Summer allowed us to duck a lot of those trends because more of us could be outdoors, windows could be open. These are simple things, but for a public health crisis, these are absolutely central issues. Countries that do not act swiftly on localized lockdowns will also suffer because infection is spreading exponentially. And then, with US, there are all kinds of constraints about, to what extent polling will result in congregation of people in close proximity and what kind of infection risk that creates. Vaccine, we cannot count on a vaccine to be in the market by early 2021. That is just a plain fact. There are several leading candidates and several phase 3 trials show promising results. The Oxford one, for example, is leading the bet, and AstraZeneca says it is absolutely ready infrastructurally to roll out 1 billion doses. But that's a fraction of the world's population. And then even if we assume that a vaccine has gone through all its tests and is ready for market use, then we have to look at all the distribution problems. How the vaccine is actually going to be made available to individual countries and the most deprived communities, what the pricing is going to be at, whether the people who can afford it least can get it. So all kinds of, like I mentioned earlier, vaccine nationalism is a very serious problem right now, because as a global community, because this is a global problem, we could be having very productive discussions about it. But we can also understand that as citizens of individual countries, we hold our national government responsible for the services it provides us. So this is not an easy question to resolve. Longer term, the WHO has made absolutely clear, and there is no reason so far evidentially to think that that is not true. COVID-19 virus is likely to get embedded in the human population just like the HIV virus. We just have to fess up and accept that that is going to be the case. We have never developed a vaccine for a viral infection since smallpox. And the difference between smallpox and this disease is that smallpox can be treated with 1 dose, which we all had as infants. Smallpox has pretty much been eradicated across the world except 6 countries, 2 of which are in South Asia, the rest are in Sub-Saharan Africa. But this vaccine, we don't know, vaccine will protect the person who has it, as well as preventing us from being carriers of that disease. So a lot of unknowns are still out there. The breakneck speed at which we are trying to develop a vaccine and rolling it out cannot be overstated. So we have to prepare for a hard winter. We have to hope that our governments will act swiftly based on evidence and take very normal precautions. Something I mentioned right at the beginning, and this is something we've done a lot of research on, what is the quality of leadership we expect from people? the sort of, the strongman approach that Bolsonaro has taken, Boris Johnson has taken, Vladimir Putin has taken, that is not serving the public health interest right now.
I have to say too that early days of the pandemic, Madeline Albright was on National Public Radio, and made just such a persuasive argument that there needs to be a globalized, concerted, not factional response effort to this. And, as you said, Megha, we've seen a lot of pockets where that approach certainly has not happened.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So that concludes the questions that we've had. So thank you so much, Megha and Michelle, for answering those questions.
Absolutely. As Susie said, that does conclude the webinar for today. We certainly hope that the information imparted was valuable to people on the webinar. As you can see, we have a slide up here which provides many ways to find out more about Oxford Analytica. And of course, please do be in touch with any questions. If we did not get to your question, we'll be following up directly with you. And another piece of follow-up that you will be receiving a recording of today's webinar shortly. I always close with stay well, stay healthy, and I hope that everyone has a good rest of their week. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone.